Welcome back to State of the FBS for week 2 of this, despite it being week 9, because just decided to start this in the middle of the season for some reason. What can you do, I guess? But another great weekend of college football this past weekend with the top 5 matchup, Texas versus Georgia, some other top 10 teams in close games, although not all of them. Shout out LSU for their dominant win over Arkansas, but let's dive right in with the Week 8 recap. Let's start with that top 5 matchup. Number 1 Texas hosting number 5 Georgia in Austin, and Georgia came ready to play. A lot of people were picking Texas in this. They weren't sure about Georgia after the performances versus Alabama and then first halves versus some other teams, but never make Kirby Smart an underdog. He was talking about, everyone doubted us, and I was one of the people that doubted. I picked Texas to win that game, and Georgia came out, and absolutely took it to the Longhorns. This defense was flying around like crazy, especially the front seven, and Quinn Ewers looked in trouble back there. I know a lot of people want to rag on the offensive line. Offensive line, I wouldn't say played terrible, but Quinn Ewers ran into a lot of sacks that game, looked scared to step up in the pocket sometimes, so even just from a scouting perspective, that's something that you worry about a little bit with Quinn Ewers that you see in these big games sometimes. It's almost like he gets a little bit afraid. Don't know if that's to do with how much he's gotten injured. He's afraid to take those hits, but whatever it was, it led to a bad day for the Texas offense as Georgia won that game 30-15. Also, good performance from Trevor Etienne in that one, him being more so the guy you wanted when you got him to transfer in from Florida with the 3 touchdowns, almost 90 yards. Solid performance from him. Then number 6, Miami, they traveled up to Louisville to take on the Louisville Cardinals, beat them 52-45. High-scoring game in the ACC, but that's what a lot of these Miami games have looked like this year. The high-powered offense starring Cam Ward, Damian Martinez, Xavier Restrepo. It's a lot of fun to watch. The defense is not fun to watch. The defense is pretty bad. They've allowed a ton of points and yards to various teams. You look at the Cal game, you look at the Virginia Tech game, this game versus Louisville. I need more consistency on the defensive side of the ball if I'm a Miami fan, because if I look at how Clemson's playing right now, I would be worried about my team going against Clemson because I think Clemson's defense will be able to keep them in that game. Miami's defense, not so sure about, but still, you can only win at who's put in front of you, and if you keep winning, that's really all you can do. So credit to Miami staying undefeated. Number 7, Alabama traveled up to Neyland to take on number 11, Tennessee, and lost for the second time in a row in Knoxville. And Tennessee, this is a fun but weird team. If you're a fan of defense, please turn on the Tennessee tape. This defense is incredible. They fly around, they diagnose well, they really fill gaps in the run game, and they're great at staying disciplined in their rush lanes. James Pierce is a freak off the edge, had a sack and a half in this game, and is really playing his way into the top 10 in the NFL draft, I think, this year, after maybe dropping out of it at the start of the year due to a lack of production. But the Tennessee offense is still kind of weirdly stuck in neutral. Nico Iamaleava is struggling with overthrows a little bit, and the run game is really carrying this offense right now. Dylan Sampson has been incredible, rushed for almost 140 yards in this game, multiple touchdowns, so if Tennessee can keep him going, keep the defense up, I think they'll be okay, but you'd like to see the passing game get a little bit more consistency. As far as Alabama, they were shut down. The run game did nothing. Jalen Milroe did nothing with his legs, and usually when Milroe struggles to run the ball, the Alabama offense struggles to move the ball. That was the case again in this one, and they lost the game as a result of it. It was a 24-17 loss. Then another top 10 team from the SEC, number 8 LSU, traveled out to Fayetteville to take on Arkansas in a game that a lot of people had labeled as a trap game coming into this week. And LSU said, no, it's not a trap game. We're going to beat the brains in of our rival. And they played their most complete game, I would say, of the season. The defense played incredibly well, holding Arkansas to barely any rushing yards at all. I believe it was 38 rushing yards. I know Jaquindon Jackson got injured, but still, that's impressive regardless of who's running the ball. Then the LSU run game played well themselves. Over 100 yards of rushing, multiple touchdowns, really good run game for LSU. Garrett Nussmeier played a clean game, did not turn the ball over. Arkansas turned it over 3 times. That's really all you need to know about this game. The turnover battle was pivotal in this one. Then number 9, Iowa State. They hosted UCF this weekend, and yikes. They looked completely fraudulent. They needed a last-second touchdown from Rocco Becht running it in from just a couple yards out to win this one 38-35. And if you're an Iowa State fan, I think you've definitely exceeded expectations at this point this year, so you can be happy with that, but I'm not holding my breath in a playoff spot at this point. If you're taking on a BYU in a conference championship game, I'd be nervous. I'd be super nervous for Farmageddon at the end of the year versus Kansas State. I just don't have a lot of hope in this team, but all you can do is beat who's in front of you, and that's what they've done. So credit to them for that. Then finally, number 13, BYU they didn't travel, they stayed at home in Utah and hosted Oklahoma State. That was on Friday night, and they squeaked out 1-2 with a long last-minute touchdown drive to win that game, and BYU keeps finding a way. I know I talk about them differently than Iowa State. They've kind of had some similar results, and they maybe haven't played the best competition. I know Arizona was a great one at the time for BYU, but they've turned out to be pretty bad. This BYU team feels like they have more potential than Iowa State. There's more quick strike ability. The defense has better upside, in my opinion, and I just like how this BYU team is positioned better as opposed to Iowa State. Although I will say right now I would still take Kansas State to win the conference overall. But that is your Week 8 recap. Now let's move on into the conference breakdowns this week. Let's start, as always, with the SEC. In the SEC, it is still Texas A&M on top of the conference right now. They are undefeated in conference play, 4-0. LSU not far behind at 3-0, and those two teams play each other this week. That should be an incredible game in Kyle Field. I'm really looking forward to it. We'll have a lot more on that later in the picks section, but should be an incredible game. LSU and A&M both control their own destiny at this point, and I think they still both control their own destiny no matter who loses this game. LSU has a difficult schedule the rest of the way out. If they win out, they're definitely into the conference championship game, I would assume. And Texas A&M has a very easy schedule outside of this game, other than their last game of the year, which is hosting Texas. And we've seen now, Texas is vulnerable. That's going to be a huge rivalry game, so A&M, I think, will be just fine, even if they lose this weekend. Next up, there's kind of a clump of Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas, Vanderbilt, all 2-1 in the conference. Georgia, Tennessee, 4-1, 3-1. The others are 2-1 in the conference. But those teams, I think, also all control their destiny still at this point. Tennessee, if they win out, they're definitely the conference title game. I doubt Missouri wins out at this point. They've really looked susceptible to upsets, even Auburn this past weekend, and Auburn is not a good football team. So Missouri, I don't see them making it there, but they technically still control their own destiny. Georgia, we know what Georgia is. If they went out, they're in. They look like an incredible football team right now. Obviously, Texas, if they went out, they would only have the one conference loss. They do get A&M at the end of the year, although they do get Vandy this week, and Vandy been sneaky this year, so you never know what's going to happen with them. Then Alabama is the first weird one for me, where I'm not quite sure what the rest of the season holds for them. Not a hugely difficult schedule. They do get LSU, but I think Missouri's really down. Obviously, the Iron Bowl shouldn't be too hard for them this year. Auburn's been horrific, but I think if Alabama wins out, they're still going to need some help to make it into the conference title game and maybe even the playoff. I doubt the committee would leave out an Alabama team if they only have 2 losses, just because that's how these things work usually, but I would still be a little bit uncomfortable if I was in the Crimson Tide's position right now. Then Arkansas and Florida, both also at 2-2 in the conference, and on very different trajectories. Arkansas kind of down right now. The ankle injury to Jaquindon Jackson is very disheartening for Arkansas fans. The quarterback spot with Taylon Green, he played okay, but what is the real ceiling of this team? I'm not sure. Landon Jackson's fun off the edge on the defensive side, but I just don't know how much you can really get from this team down the stretch. Now, on the other hand, with Florida, how about the dynamite freshman for the Gators this past week in the game versus Kentucky? Jaden Ball, #run the ball if you're a Florida fan. 5 touchdowns, tied the Florida rushing touchdown record in a single game with Trey Burton back when he did that, and that's pretty exciting. DJ Lagway, too, was throwing absolute bombs, only a 50% completion percentage, but who cares about completion percentage if you're throwing bombs? The interception, obviously not great, and no touchdowns. That's because Jaden Ball had 5. So, really encouraged by the Florida performance this weekend. This team has not quit on Coach Billy Napier, despite a lot of the fan base having doing so, and I think that's a real testament to his abilities as a leader, even if he can struggle to call plays at times. Then South Carolina sits at 2-3 in the conference. They just beat up on Oklahoma. Oklahoma's terrible. They have no offensive identity. South Carolina still has the great edge duo of Kyle Kennard and Dylan Stewart, and the problem for South Carolina is their schedule the rest of the way. They still have Clemson on the docket. It's not a favorable schedule for the Gamecocks. Lenore Sellers is solid at least. I think this team will really improve next year as well, as Dylan Stewart will improve, Lenore Sellers will improve. I think this team's going to experience some growth, but as far as this year, you're average, and I think that South Carolina fans would honestly take that going into this year with how down a lot of people were on that team. But then the basement of the conference, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Auburn, and Mississippi State, and technically Ole Miss as well. They're 1-2 in the conference. They're not great, so I expect Ole Miss to rise back up through there. I don't think they're playoff material anymore at this point, but the rest of this conference mess down at the bottom. Kentucky, not really any offensive identity. Auburn kind of has an offensive identity, but that identity is turning the football over, and that's not really something you want to do ever. Mississippi State, weird that I think is the most upside of any of these teams. Michael Van Buren has looked very solid over the last couple weeks. This team has played Georgia close. They played Texas A&M close. I think they might give some team a shock later down the schedule this year. And then for Oklahoma, I mentioned the complete lack of offensive identity. They're really going to struggle to win games, I think. But as far as the playoffs go for SEC teams, I think that Texas and Georgia and honestly maybe LSU as well are all sitting really pretty right now as far as making it in. LSU, the only reason I hesitate slightly is because of the rest of their schedule. I would say A&M also looks very good to make it into the playoffs. Tennessee, I'm nervous about because you still have to play Georgia. I think that might be another loss for the Volunteers, especially having to play that game in Sanford Stadium, but we'll see what they can do with that. I think Missouri is not a playoff team this year. Alabama, like I said earlier, right on the fringe. And then Vanderbilt, technically Vanderbilt controls their own destiny. If they win out, they're in the SEC championship game in all likelihood, and then would probably be a playoff team, but I think that one, that doesn't happen, and two, even if they were in the mix, the Georgia State loss would really hurt their at-large resume. Some games later in the SEC this week, Texas travels to Vanderbilt, potential upset there. I know everyone's going to be saying, I think Texas is able to get that done. Obviously, the big game, LSU versus Texas A&M, hugely important for seeding at the top of the conference and who's in the best place to go to Atlanta. Missouri at Alabama, this game I think is going to be weird. Missouri's susceptible to the two things Alabama is really good at, which is running the ball and explosive plays, so I'd be worried if I was a Missouri fan. Arkansas-Mississippi State, I think, is an under-the-radar fun game. If you, for some reason, aren't interested in anything else going on Saturday, I would flip that game on. I think it'll be entertaining for sure. Then Oklahoma-Ole Miss is going to be please don't see TV, because Oklahoma cannot move the ball, and Ole Miss has a tendency to struggle versus these lower-tier opponents sometimes, as you saw with Kentucky. But that is it for your SEC breakdown this week. Let's move it right on over up north to the Midwest and the Big Ten. Now over in the Big Ten, this is a really fun conference right now. A lot of fun sleepers. Well, maybe Indiana isn't a sleeper anymore now that they're ranked number 13, but Illinois is still right up there. Wisconsin, 3-1 in the conference. They've been playing solid football as of late, but it's still Oregon and Penn State at the top here, right with Indiana, 4-0, 4-0, 3-0 respectively for Indiana, Oregon, and Penn State. And those three teams, I think, have all been playing solid football. I'm the most nervous about Penn State just because of how they've struggled with teams like Southern Cal, and they go on the road to Wisconsin this week. I think that's going to be a very difficult game for sure. Illinois is a weird team. They've played solid football, but they don't seem to be able to beat those upper-tier opponents right now, which is fine. I think you're not necessarily expecting that as an Illinois fan right now, even though this team is good. So maybe wait a couple years, maybe you'll be built up to that level. Obviously, Ohio State is still in the mix here, even though they are only 2-1 in the conference. They're still a very, very, very good football team. So definitely not writing off the Buckeyes by any stretch of the imagination. Then in the basement down there, it is still Rutgers, Southern Cal, UCLA, and Purdue. So a little bit funny to me that two of the teams that essentially nuked the Pac-12 are second and third to last in this conference above only Purdue. Horrific. I don't know how much you've watched Purdue, but don't. It's not worth your time. Unless it's the Illinois game, which Illinois almost lost. But anyway, this very competitive conference this year. I still expect Oregon to be able to make the Big Ten Conference title game and win it at this point. I like what I've seen from this Oregon team. Really capitalized on the opportunity versus Ohio State, and Dan Lanning is an excellent coach for sure. But this past weekend in the Big Ten, a lot of good games. Oregon took on Purdue, 35-0. Purdue's terrible. Next, Indiana took on Nebraska. This was a game that a lot of people had marked as maybe a potential upset spot for Indiana, and Indiana beat the brains out of Nebraska, 56-7. Curtis Rourke continues his, I don't want to say Heisman campaign, but sleeper Heisman campaign. He's kind of right in the bottom area of that mix, and fourth guys down there, but I really like what I've seen from Indiana this year. Kurt Signetti has that program really turned in the right direction. They are 7-0 right now, almost a top 10. Top 10 Indiana, maybe, over the next couple weeks? You never know. Then Michigan and Illinois, this was classic Big Ten West football, even though the divisions don't exist anymore and these teams are in the East. Don't worry about it. But Michigan turned the ball over 3 times despite outgaining Illinois and lost as a result. Michigan, this is just not the same Michigan team. They lost so much of the talent. It's very visible, and they're really struggling to beat teams this year. Illinois played solid in this one, enough to get it done. They move up to number 20 in the rankings as a result. Wisconsin beat Northwestern the words 23-3. 20 tweet. Wisconsin beat Northwestern 23-3 in that game. Solid game from the Badgers. They just keep knocking off wins at this point, and obviously a good opportunity versus Penn State this weekend to notch up a really big one for that program. UCLA finally won a game. They beat Rutgers 35-32, and after a 4-0 start, Rutgers has now dropped 3 in a row to Nebraska, Wisconsin, and UCLA, so the Scarlet Knights kind of fallen back to earth down there at the bottom of the Big Ten. Southern Cal lost to Maryland. Jeez. Billy Edwards and Caden Prather had an excellent connection going in this one. Prather going for 9 receptions for 111 yards. Solid game. The USC Classic defense looks to be back. They're really struggling to stop anything right now. And then, how about Michigan State moving to 4-3, 2-2 in the Big Ten? Aiden Childs is really developing as the year goes on. Threw for 256 and a touchdown in this game. He's really improved. Caleb Johnson just cannot do enough to get Iowa to win these games on his own. They're going to need a passing game, and I don't think you get one of those until you find a new offensive coordinator. Looking ahead to next week in the Big Ten, there are a lot of good matchups, and namely one we've already mentioned a couple times, this Penn State at Wisconsin game I think is going to be a very close game, very entertaining game. Rutgers travels to Southern Cal, and that's going to be a weird game. Both of those teams are kind of in free fall right now. We'll see who can rebound. Nebraska travels to Ohio State. Rough 2-game stretch from Nebraska, the Indiana game, and now this. I would expect this to go pretty similarly, if I'm being honest. Washington travels to Indiana this weekend. College game day will be there. First time ever, they will be going up to Bloomington for an Indiana game, so always cool as a fan base to get to experience that for the first time. Number 20, Illinois is on the road at Oregon. That'll be in the picks segment later, but I think this will be at least an intriguing game. Northwestern is at Iowa. I would expect to win this. Northwestern does not have a good run defense, and Iowa has Caleb Johnson. Maryland plays at Minnesota in the battle of teams that have collectively ruined Southern Cal's season, and I think Maryland wins that game, honestly. I like what I've seen from Billy Edwards this season. 13 touchdowns, only 4 picks, been playing solid football. Then the rivalry game, Michigan State at Michigan, and Michigan might be on upset alert again. This is not a good Michigan team, and Aiden Childs, like I said earlier, is improving week by week. I really think he and the Spartans could stun the Wolverines this weekend for the first time in a while. But as far as the Big Ten's playoff hopes, I think Oregon and Ohio State are pretty much marked in at this point. Penn State, I think, is in a weird spot where they need to win out in the conference to make the conference title game, in my opinion, and I'm just not sure that they're going to be able to do that when you look at their schedule. They have, obviously, at Wisconsin, then they get Ohio State. The rest of the schedule is not too bad, but I don't think they're able to beat Ohio State, and then you look at a team like Indiana, who also is in this conference, who's playing incredible football. I think it starts to get really crowded at the top really quickly. I think Indiana has a playoff chance as well, but those 4 teams, I think if the Big Ten is going to get a max in, it would be all of those 4, and it would take a very specific scenario for that to happen. But that's kind of your playoff outlook for the Big Ten this week, and that is it for the conference overall. Let's move it back down to, I would say, the Atlantic Coast, but Cal and Stanford are there, and also SMU. So let's move it to the whole entire country and talk about the ACC. The ACC has been a surprisingly strong league this year. If you look at the records of some of these teams, obviously Clemson and Miami stand out immediately, 7-0 and 6-1 respectively, but SMU is 6-1, Pitt is 6-0 right now and ranked, Duke is 6-1, Syracuse is 5-1. There's a lot of talent in the ACC this year, and I think that this is a conference that gets multiple teams into the CFP at the end of the year. I think both Clemson and Miami make it for them, and they're going to have some nice resume-building wins. You look at this Pitt team, this SMU team, if you play either one of those teams, they're going to be a nice feather in your cap. Syracuse as well, Duke, any of those teams I think will be excellent wins for any ACC team that would happen to play them and beat them. But let's take a look at what happened the last week in the conference. Virginia Tech took down Boston College in convincing fashion, 42-21. Florida State lost to Duke for the first time in program history. Wow. To move to 1-6 on the year, big struggle town for the Seminoles. We already talked about the Louisville and Miami game. Clemson beat Virginia at home in the return of Tony Elliott to Death Valley. Feel-good story there, but Clemson taking care of business for sure. Notre Dame beat Georgia Tech 31-13. SMU obliterated Stanford. Wake Forest squeaked out a win over UConn. Yeah. And then NC State beat Cal by 1 point, meaning Cal has now lost multiple games by one possession, or a lot of games by one possession. There was the Florida State game, the Miami game, the NC State game. They've had a lot of barely missed opportunities. The Pitt game, all these games by barely any margin. Cal is so close to being 6-1 right now, but instead they are 3-4. But that's just how it goes. If you look at the standings in the conference right now, it is Clemson, Miami, SMU, Pitt, Duke, and Syracuse atop the conference, and those are all very solid teams in my opinion. They all have great players, and they've really all showed out this year. And two of these teams actually play each other this week on Thursday. So today, if you're watching this as it comes out tonight on Thursday, Pittsburgh will host Syracuse, and this is a fun QB battle. Eli Holstein and Kyle McCord are two of the upper tier quarterbacks in the ACC this year, in my opinion. Obviously, Cam Ward and Cade Klubnik are the top two, but moving after them, I think these guys are right in that next tier. Two very solid teams. I think Pitt needs to be worried about Syracuse for sure. I think there's a sneaky Syracuse team. They might pull off the upset here. Boston College hosts Louisville in a battle of two teams that looked very hot to start the year and then have fallen flat. I'm a little bit worried about Louisville in this one just because of the skill of Thomas Castellanos and the Boston College attack. I think that the Louisville defense struggled a bit this year. They might be vulnerable here. Georgia Tech versus Virginia Tech, the Battle of the Techs, is another good game this weekend. But one under-the-radar game that I'm very excited for is 3-4 North Carolina versus 4-3 Virginia. And Anthony Calandria and Omarion Hampton on the same field is going to be an electric factory. Hampton for UNC at running back, Calandria at quarterback for the Cavaliers. That's going to be a very fun game, I think. I would expect Virginia to win just because North Carolina has no semblance of a defense, and Virginia does. Wake Forest plays Stanford in the battle for the bottom of the conference, except Florida State wasn't invited. Then Cal takes on Oregon State in a classic Pac-12 matchup, even though this is the ACC section because of conference realignment. Then Florida State travels down to Coral Gables to take on Miami, and this should, you never know this season, but should be a murder. Miami, on paper, is just leagues better than this Florida State team, and I think they're going to want to get revenge from the beatdown that Florida State gave them a couple years ago at home, so look for Miami to be putting up big numbers in this one. Then my favorite game of the week in the ACC is number 22 SMU traveling to Duke in a battle of 6-1 teams. We'll touch on that a bit later in the picks segment, so stay tuned for that. As far as the college football playoff chance for the ACC, mentioned earlier, it's Clemson, it's Miami. If maybe an SMU or a Pitt wins out, they could get like the 11 seed, but I think it is just Clemson or Miami or both at this point for the ACC. So that's kind of your playoff outlook for them at this point. Let's finish off the Power 4 with the Big 12. The Big 12 has probably been the most unpredictable Power 4 league this year, and if you look at the standings, it won't take a long time to see why. At the top are BYU, Iowa State, and Kansas State, followed by Texas Tech, Cincinnati, and Colorado. Texas Tech and Cincinnati have come absolutely out of nowhere. Those coaches doing an incredible job. Texas Tech and Cincinnati are both 5-2 at this point in the year. Colorado 5-2 as well, and so is Arizona State. Those are all teams that are playing very solid football. But then if you look near the bottom of the conference, there's a lot of the teams that people thought would win it. Oklahoma State is dead last at 0-4 in the conference and 3-4 overall. Kansas is doing terribly as well. They are 2-5. Utah's 4-3. Arizona's 3-4. Both of those teams are just 1-3 in conference play. And so yeah, very topsy-turvy Big 12 right now. Right now, my favorite would still be Kansas State for this league. I think Texas Tech is dangerous because of their offensive attack. I like BYU a lot. I think Iowa State is probably the third best team in this league right now, if I had to say. Obviously, there's all the hype around Colorado. Can they sustain that through the rest of the year? I don't know. Then Cincinnati is the weirdest one for me. I did not see that coming at all. I don't know if anyone else did. If you were on the bandwagon at the start of the year, that would be a very small bandwagon for Cincinnati to be this good. Please let me know because I would be very impressed by that. But this past week in the Big 12, we already touched on the Oklahoma State BYU game. That was a thriller, and the UCF Iowa State game. But Kansas State absolutely destroyed West Virginia. Very solid performance from them. Avery Johnson had a good game in that one, throwing for 3 touchdowns. Cincinnati upset Arizona State. That was at home for Cincinnati. I think that played a big part of it. But great game for the Bearcats, really shutting down this Arizona State rushing attack that's been so good all year. And they got the win because of it. Moved to 5-2. Very impressed by them. Kansas finally getting another conference win, beating Houston 42-14. This Houston team is awful. Only because Oklahoma State exists are they not the bottom of this conference right now. Colorado beat Arizona badly, 34-7. Arizona's probably one of the more disappointing teams in the country for me thus far. The no Fita Teteroy McMillan connection has been a bit faulty, and then the defense looks just bad. The defense is flat out awful. They cannot stop anything this season, and it's proving that Jed Fish was really important down there in Tucson. Then the surprise of the week in the Big 12 was Baylor beating Texas Tech 59-35. This is a Baylor team that came into this game at 2-4 overall and 0-3 in the conference and took down a Texas Tech team that had a lot of momentum. So I was very impressed with the Bears, especially this game being in Lubbock. Great performance from Baylor. Then the last game was TCU at Utah, and this game was a terrible game. TCU won 13-7. Both teams are now 4-3, and Utah is once again missing an injured Cam Rising, who will surely come back for his 27th season next year. Looking ahead to this coming week, BYU travels down to Florida to take on UCF. I would expect the Mormons to take that one. Oklahoma State at Baylor. Normally I'd say Oklahoma State easily, but with how Baylor's playing recently and Oklahoma State has not won a conference game, flip a coin on that one, honestly. I'll probably still take Oklahoma State, but it's a lot closer than I think I would have said at the start of the year. Texas Tech at TCU is a sneaky good game. I'd expect the Red Raiders to be able to pull that out. West Virginia at Arizona in the battle of teams that were hyped at the start of the year and have not delivered. Obviously, Garrett Green has struggled for the Mountaineers, and we already mentioned the Arizona attack. Utah at Houston in the battle of bad red teams. I would expect Utah to still take this one. Houston is much worse than Utah. Even though Utah's not great, Houston is much worse. Kansas at Kansas State. Never know what's going to happen in a rivalry game, but Kansas State is so good right now. They're really on form. I love the rushing attack duo they have, and Avery Johnson is also an incredible player. Then the real good game of the week in the Big 12 is 5-2 Colorado versus 5-2 Cincinnati. I think the winner of this game ends up ranked, or at least should be, at 6-2, and I know a lot of people are going to be taking Colorado in this game. I do agree with them, but I think Cincinnati plays this game close. I think Cincinnati's going to come into this game doubted. They're going to be motivated, and if Colorado's not careful, I think Cincinnati could shock them. But as far as the Big 12's playoff hopes for this year, I think this is a one-bid league, honestly. I don't see them having enough top-end talent to get two teams in, especially with Notre Dame floating out there in limbo, whatever they're doing. I think it's Kansas State. I think Kansas State is the best team in this conference. I think BYU's second, Iowa State's third. I trust the Kansas State defense more than the BYU defense. I know we've seen BYU beat Kansas State by a ton earlier this year, but a lot of weird things went down in that game. Granted, it's still an impressive win because you beat them by a lot at home. Great win for BYU, but I think if you play that game again on a neutral field, a lot of bounces maybe go a different way. Kansas State could come out on top with a win there. So I think the Wildcats are the Big 12's only team in the playoff this season. But that is your full Power 4 wrap-up for the week. Let's jump on over to the Group of 5. First up on the Group of 5 docket is the American, which is still led appropriately by Army and Navy, ranked 23rd and 24th. Both service academies are playing great football. This option attack is really working for both of them. Both of these quarterbacks have been playing incredible football. Over 20 total touchdowns for Blake Horvath on the season. I really love what he's done with Navy, and they have a great chance to pull off a good upset this week versus Notre Dame. That'll be in the pick section as well, so we'll preview that later. But talking about what went down this past weekend in the American, Army beat ECU up, which makes sense because the Eastern Carolinas would not beat the Army. There's your in-depth analysis for you. Similarly, Charlotte did not beat the Navy. Also makes sense. Navy put up 51 on Charlotte. Blake Horvath continues to play incredible football. Temple beat Tulsa in the Battle of the Basement in this conference. South Florida took out UAB. UAB is one of the worst teams in this conference. UTSA and Owen McCown beat Florida Atlantic 38-24. Solid game for the Roadrunners. Even though they were at home, still fairly impressive. And FAU now falls to 0-3 in the conference. And then Tulane moves to 3-0 in the conference to win over Rice 24-10. Then in the big game of the week in the American, 5-1 going into this game, Memphis versus 5-1 going into this game, North Texas. And Memphis came out on top, 52-44. Chandler Morris is such a weird quarterback. He puts up a ton of stats every time, and then he launches picks. He threw only one in this game, but he did throw for 445 and 3 touchdowns. And if you're a quarterback and you put up that stat line and lose the game, it's got to hurt. The North Texas defense just could not hang, and Memphis hung 52 on them in response. But coming up this next weekend, there are a lot of good games in the American as well. Obviously not a American Conference game, but Notre Dame travels up to MetLife Stadium to take on Navy. That should be a very fun game. Charlotte plays at Memphis. Charlotte should get obliterated, but you never know. Temple at Eastern Carolina. I would really love to watch the game if Savone Revel was playing, but unfortunately he is out for the year after a practice injury. Rice plays UConn. Hooray. And then UTSA takes on Tulsa in another kind of middle of the road / basement game in the American. But the big game of the week in this conference is Tulane versus North Texas. And I'm going to be very excited to see how this Tulane defense handles the North Texas passing attack and Chandler Morris. He's thrown for 2,400 yards on the year, that's Cam Ward territory, which is just ridiculous. I think Chandler Morris is not getting enough love for North Texas this season. Cam Ward has thrown for 2,500 yards this season. Chandler Morris at about 2,400, so that gives you an idea. And Morris has only thrown for one less touchdown than Cam Ward, has thrown 3 more picks, but I know it's the American, but that's kind of a frame of reference for the season that Chandler Morris is having. Then the Tulane offense has also been solid. Mario Williams is playing a great receiver for them, and Mekhi Hughes is such a fun running back to watch. 5.5 per carry on the season, does have 8 touchdowns as well, so I think it's going to be slightly different offensive styles. Tulane looking to run the ball first, North Texas looking to air it out. Should be a fun game. And since Tulane is at home for this one, since North Texas is at home for this one, I am going to take North Texas. I think Chandler Morris balls out. I think he has a great game. I think North Texas moves to 6-2. But as far as the playoff outlook for this conference, it's a little weird because Army and Navy play each other the week after the conference championship week, which is when Selection Sunday is. So theoretically, you could have an undefeated Army and Navy play each other in the conference championship. Let's say Boise State falls out, which I don't think is going to happen. But if Army-Navy play each other then, that's for a playoff spot probably. But then if the conference champion gets selected and then the next week the final reverses, like if the other team wins and they split that matchup, that's an absolute headache because I guess I just never assumed that either of these teams would make the playoff. And now it might bite them this year. It's going to be really weird. I don't think this league gets a team in the playoffs because I think Boise State takes the group of 5 spot, but it's going to be very fun and very interesting with Army and Navy being so good this year. I think it's going to cause a headache for a lot of committee members for sure, but that's your American outlook. Now let's move on over into CUSA. Well, I was prepared to say CUSA is pretty straightforward and Liberty's taking it, but then I checked the scores of the game going on right now, and Kennesaw State is currently up on Liberty 24-17 with 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter as I record this, though Liberty does have the ball. Davis Bryson's been playing solid for Kennesaw State in this one, so I guess you never know what's going to happen in a Wednesday night game in CUSA, but Jacksonville State is, however, taking care of business versus Middle Tennessee State. On Tuesday, Sam Houston State beat Florida International 10-7, and then Louisiana Tech took down UTEP 14-10. The team that we would be positioned to move into the top of this league if Liberty does lose is Western Kentucky. They are on bye this week. They are 5-2, 3-0 in the conference. Liberty is 5-0, maybe 5-1 after today. Who knows? Then Kennesaw State was 0-6 going into tonight. Just proves that you never know what's going to happen in college football. But not a ton to talk about with CUSA, especially on the playoff front. They don't have a playoff team. Liberty would need to win out and have chaos happen, and I just don't think they're ever going to get ranked high enough to make that, especially with how good Boise State, Army, and Navy are this year. So no playoffs for CUSA. Sorry if you're an avid CUSA fan. I don't even know if there are avid CUSA fans. I know they're avid fans of CUSA teams, but you know how they're like those SEC fans? They're like, it just means more SEC all the time. I don't think there's any of those for CUSA, so apologies if you're one of those. But that is it for CUSA today. So we're going to take it over from there into the MAC. How about some MACtion? MACtion continued as usual this past weekend, and Eastern Michigan beat Central Michigan in a very solid game, 38-34. Miami took down Ohio, 30-20. Bowling Green took down Kent State, 27-6, behind 171 yards from Harold Finnean Jr. If you watched last week's episode, you'll remember Harold Finnean Jr., probably one of the best tight ends in the country this season for Bowling Green. Western Michigan took down Buffalo 48-41 in a game right at the top of the MAC as Western Michigan remained undefeated in the conference. Toledo took down Northern Illinois to move to 5-2 on the season. And then Ball State had to travel to Nashville and lost to Vanderbilt. Bit of a rough week for them. Kind of mean to make them do that in the middle of the year. But upcoming this week, we have 4-3 Buffalo versus 4-3 Ohio. Central Michigan travels to Miami of Ohio. Eastern Michigan's at Akron. Northern Illinois is at Ball State. The game of the week for me is 3-4 Bowling Green at 5-2 Toledo. I'll be curious to see if Toledo can slow down Harold Fanine, and then 0-7 Kent State travels up to Western Michigan to take them on. But conference standings wise, it is Western Michigan at the top, 3-0 in conference. Miami, Buffalo, Toledo, Eastern Michigan, and Ohio, and Bowling Green all sit at 2-1. So this conference championship spot is still wide open for the MAC. I like Bowling Green at this point, honestly. This is a team that I mentioned last week. They're much better than their record suggests. They have close losses to Texas A&M and Penn State, two very good teams, and Harold Fanine Jr. is going to be a problem for every single person that Bowling Green plays. I think he can carry that team basically on his own to a MAC title game appearance, and I would expect them to probably face either Western Michigan or Buffalo at this point in the season. But the MAC, like CUSA, I don't think has any playoff hopes necessarily. There's just not enough quality of teams. You would need a MAC team to have an out-of-conference game versus I think the only way a MAC team makes the playoff is if someone like Bowling Green this year with the games versus Penn State and Texas A&M, if they take advantage of those, I think that's the only way you see that happen. But so no playoffs for the MAC this year. We will move on from the MAC down to the Mountain West, and it's Boise State all day, every day. They are technically tied for the top of the conference right now with UNLV, Colorado State, and San Diego State. All those teams are 2-0, and all those teams are solid as well. Colorado State has a great receiver in Torrey Horton. San Jose State has Nick Nash. They're 3-1 in the conference. Nick Nash is an incredible player. I mentioned him in my Heisman discussion last week. I think he's amazing. UNLV is a very good offense as well. They play Boise State this Friday. That should be an absolutely incredible game. Very much looking forward to seeing those two teams take on each other. And as far as other games in the Mountain West this week, New Mexico travels to Colorado State. We'd expect Colorado State to take that. Battle of the Basement, Utah State takes on Wyoming. Don't watch that game, please, for your own sanity. San Jose State travels to Fresno State. I would expect San Jose State to be able to pick up a win there. San Diego State hosts Washington State. I think they lose that game. Washington State is 6-1. They are a very solid team. Then Nevada travels down to the islands to take on Hawaii, and I think Hawaii actually wins the game. I think Hawaii is going to have to do that. They gave Boise State a run for their money when they played them, so Hawaii is definitely a solid football team. Last week, Fresno State took down Nevada. Washington State blew out Hawaii. New Mexico barely beat Utah State. San Jose State took down Wyoming. That was a fun game. Colorado State beat the Air Force. The Air Force apparently didn't get the memo that military academies are supposed to be good this year as they fall to 1-6. And then UNLV actually took down Oregon State. So good win for the Rebels there. And I think this is a playoff league. I think Boise State makes the playoff in the group of 5 spot for the Mountain West. I think they're good enough to beat UNLV. I think they ride Ashton Genty to a playoff berth. But while we're on the Mountain West, we'll stick with kind of Mountain West adjacent in the Pac-12. Already mentioned the games for Oregon State and Washington State. And Oregon State taking on Cal this week. Washington State, obviously, the other game we just mentioned. And Washington State at 6-1. Oregon State at 4-3. I don't think either of these teams have a playoff chance. Washington State just does not have the schedule to be able to do that, to be honest, and Oregon State is bad. So it is what it is for those guys. Now, finally, over to our last group of 5 conference in the Sun Belt. Let's talk Fun Belt in the Sun Belt, and this is the only conference still to have divisions in the FBS, fun fact. And in the East, Georgia Southern still leads over Old Dominion, Marshall, and James Madison, Coastal Carolina. Then App State and Georgia State both sit at 0-3 in conference. Georgia State last in this division despite a win over Vanderbilt earlier in the year. So college football is weird. What can you say? Over in the West, Louisiana and UL Monroe are both 3-0 in the conference. Louisiana 6-1, UL Monroe 5-1. That should be a very fun game later in the season between those two teams. Texas State is 2-1 as well as Arkansas State and South Alabama. Then Southern Miss and Troy both 0-3 in the conference in the basement down there. Marshall took down Georgia State this past weekend. South Alabama had a good game versus Troy in that rivalry. Very fun game down there, and one thing that I will say, I very much enjoy checking the South Alabama stat lines on ESPN because it always says a USA, so practically a 4th military academy out there down in Mobile for sure. No, obviously not, but Louisiana took down Coastal Carolina in Conway 34-24. Old Dominion hosted Texas State, took home that win 24-14. Georgia Southern handed James Madison another loss, 28-14, and goodness, how bad is North Carolina? That's all I have to say about that. James Madison beat them earlier this year. Then Arkansas State took down Southern Miss 44-28. This week in the Sun Belt, Georgia Southern takes on Old Dominion. In the Battle of the Basement, Georgia State takes on App State. I think it was Georgia State earlier. Georgia Southern takes on Old Dominion. So, not two Georgia State games this weekend. Then Southern Miss plays James Madison. My Sun Belt game of the week, I know it's a very fun sentence, is UL Monroe at South Alabama. I think the Jaguars will at least put up a fight in this game versus General Booty and the Warhawks. Then Troy and Arkansas State, I think, should also be an entertaining game as well. I don't know about Troy, man. I think this is a better team than the stats show for Troy. I think they will at least have a pulse in this one. I don't think they win, but I think they at least make Arkansas State have to fight for it. And if you're Troy at this point in the season, that's all you can really ask for. The Sun Belt is unfortunately not a playoff league either for me. I think it would have to be UL Monroe or Louisiana, if anyone at this point, and I just don't think either of those teams have the schedule to make it that high in the rankings later in the year. You would have needed Georgia State to beat Vanderbilt probably and then go on a run the rest of the year, but that did not happen, so there will be no Fun Belt in the playoffs this year. You heard that here first. No fun in the playoffs this season, but that is it for conference breakdowns for this week. Thank you guys for tuning into that. And now we will jump over into the playoff picture. And this is where I changed it up a little bit from last week. Because last week I kind of just looked at the rankings. I was like, this is what the playoff picture would be. Now I'm doing my predictions as far as this point in the season. So I'm taking Oregon to be the 1 seed. I think Oregon is a very good team. We've seen them beat Ohio State once. I think they can do it again. I have Georgia in my 2. I think they are your SEC champions. You saw it versus Texas. This is a very, very good D-line. I think a lot of teams are going to struggle to beat them for sure. I have Clemson in my 3 now. I like this Clemson team a lot. Cade Klubnik is playing incredible football, and there's a very, very good defense led by Peter Woods up the middle on the defensive line. In my 4 seed, I have Kansas State. I think they win the Big 12. I think they are the only Big 12 team in the playoffs this year. For the 12 seed, for the group of 5 spot, it's going to be Boise State, and that's not saying they are the 12 seed. They might be up high enough to be ranked 10 or 11. But Boise State is my group of 5 team. Then for my at-larges, I have Ohio State, Texas, Miami, Penn State, Texas A&M, Indiana, and LSU. I know that's a lot of SEC, but I think Texas A&M and Texas have favorable enough schedules to get there, and then LSU, I think, will have good enough quality wins to make it. Ohio State, I think, is all but locked. All they have to do is not goof up the rest of the way, and I think that would honestly save Ryan Day's job. If they make the playoff, I think that will be enough to keep him in Columbus for another year. Miami, I think, is definitely good enough to be there. I think they will have an incredible game versus Clemson in the ACC Championship. The thing with Miami, though, is they don't have a single ranked team on their schedule right now, which is not great. So you'd need to at least put up a fight versus Clemson, in my opinion, to make the playoffs still. Penn State, I think, makes it by virtue of not having an overly difficult schedule apart from the Ohio State game, so I think they will be able to ride that out. And then give me Indiana to make it as well. I think they are a very, very good team. I love what Curt Cignetti's doing there. Curtis O'Rourke is playing incredible football, so Indiana in the playoffs for me as well. Now over to the Heisman race. It's Ashton Jeanty all day, every day still. He has 126 carries for 1,248 yards and 17 touchdowns, averaging right around 9 yards per carry still at this point in the season, playing incredible football, just ridiculous. This is something we haven't seen done in really since Barry Sanders was around. I still think he breaks that record by the end of the year. Number 2 is Cam Ward from Miami, still putting up crazy numbers. He's got to limit the fumbles more. I think he's really improved as far as not turning the ball over as much as the year has gone on. You're going to need to see him take better and better care of the football. I think Miami needs to win the ACC if Cam Ward wants the Heisman as well, considering what Ashton Jeanty is doing. In 3rd, it is Travis Hunter still. The two-way player is just so impressive at this point, and Cincinnati, I think, is going to be a really good chance for him to show what he can do. Cincinnati comes into that game at 5-2, and anytime you can put up a solid two-way performance versus a quality opponent, it's going to be really impressive. Then Curtis Rourke for Indiana moves into my number 4 this week. Just wanted to show Nick Nash some love last week. And Rourke has thrown for 1,941 yards, 15 touchdowns, and only 3 picks, and has led Indiana to a 7-0 record. So I've been very impressed with him for sure, and I think he deserves to be in the Heisman conversation in this lower end as well. Now, to round it off this week, we have the weekly picks segment, and let's just run through, starting with number 1 Oregon hosting number 20 Illinois. I don't think Illinois has the defense for this game. I think Oregon's going to be able to outscore them. I expect Dylan Gabriel to have good numbers. I really want to see Evan Stewart and Tev Johnson put up numbers in this game. You need to keep doing that consistently if you want people to take this offensive attack seriously. So I'd like to see big numbers from Oregon versus this Illinois team. I think that would go a long way to establishing them firmly as a serious contender. I know they're number one. That might sound insane to say, but there have been some questions about this Oregon offense in earlier games in the season, and they have great wins over Boise State. They have great wins over Ohio State, and I think they deserve to be the number one team in the country. But I know there are some people still questioning the explosivity of this offense. So if you want to show these people you mean business, hang a bunch of points on Illinois, because Purdue did it a couple weeks ago. Then number 3, Penn State travels up to Wisconsin, and I'm a bit nervous for Penn State in this one. Drew Aller has improved a lot, but Braden Locke has also been solid for Wisconsin, and this is a weird game. I never like teams having to go up and play in Madison. It's always dangerous. Luke Fickell is obviously a good coach. You never know what you're going to get from this Wisconsin team, and Penn State needs to be careful. We saw them almost lose at Southern Cal a couple weeks ago. They might be in the same boat here if they really don't buckle down, so I am going to take Penn State, though, still on the road. I do expect them to win this game. And for the first game, give me Oregon. Forgot to say that. Number 4, Ohio State hosts Nebraska. Nebraska just can't keep up. They got blown out by Indiana. I would expect similar things to happen here. Give me number 4, Ohio State. Then number 5, Texas traveling to Vandy. This is a fun matchup. This is 2 of the best tight ends in the country, and Eli Stowers for Vanderbilt and Gunnar Helm for Texas. And this is such a weird game because you get the bounce back for Texas, and then Vanderbilt with a ton of momentum right now. They're ranked for the first time in forever. They're going to want to win this game. It's going to be such a feel-good story. I just think Texas is too much. I think the speed on the outside for Texas of Isaiah Bond and Ryan Wingo is too much for the Vanderbilt defense to be able to handle. I expect the Texas defense to be able to stay home against the option, and the secondary is so good. I think they can contain Pavia down the field, so give me Texas. Then number 8, LSU traveling to Kyle Field to take on number 14, Texas A&M. I like A&M in this one. I've really been impressed by this A&M team over the last few weeks. Obviously, the huge win over a Missouri team that has not been great the rest of the season, but I still think this is a very solid A&M offense led by Le'Veon Moss, and then the defense is incredible. I would expect them to give LSU a rough day for sure in this game, and if you're LSU, I think you can not necessarily live with losing this game, but it's not a season killer if you do. So I'm taking Texas A&M to win this one. And then number 12, Notre Dame taking on number 24, Navy. I think Notre Dame really struggles to contain the option game in this one. I expect Blake Horvath to have a big day for the midshipmen, and I think Navy stays undefeated and knocks off Notre Dame. This Navy defense has also been very solid all season, and Riley Leonard has struggled a lot this year, so I think that the Navy defense is really going to be instrumental in this as well. Give me the midshipmen. Number 15, Alabama hosts Missouri this weekend. Number 21, Missouri. And Missouri is susceptible to 2 things. They are the run game and the deep ball over the top. And if you look at the Alabama offense, it is the run game and the deep ball over the top. So I think Missouri is really going to struggle in this one. I expect Alabama to win this game. Alabama needs a bounce back right now. They need a statement win, and I think this is the best chance they're going to get. Give me the Crimson Tide. Number 17, Boise State, is at UNLV on Friday night. That should be a very fun game. Ashton Jeanty, obviously, you know what he is. Haj Malik Williams has been playing incredible football for UNLV this season, leads the team in both passing and rushing, and then Ricky White has been solid out on the outside for them as well. I still think Ashton Jeanty is just too much. I'm going to take Boise State in this game. Then number 19, Pitt hosts Syracuse this week, and this is a under-the-radar fun game. I am going to take Pitt. I think it's a lot because they're on their home turf. I think either way, I would pick the home team in this game. The Syracuse offense has been fun. Kyle McCord has been putting up great numbers, launching a bit too many picks, though, considering how many touchdowns he's thrown. I think he needs to work that balance a little bit better than LaQuint Allen. I think you really need to lean on him in this game. The Pitt defense has been a little bit susceptible to run. You saw it versus Cal. I think if you can get Allen going, that'll open up the game for Kyle McCord, and he's going to be able to push the ball down the field. That's your way to winning this game. I still am taking Pitt and Eli Holstein, though. Then, finally, number 22, SMU, taking on Duke this weekend. And Kevin Jennings for SMU is playing really good football. 1,300 passing yards, 9 touchdowns, 2 picks. Has not started every game because SMU had a bit of a quarterback controversy to start the year. But since he's been in, has been playing very, very good football. He'll have to go up against Malik Murphy, who's also been playing solid, has 1,500 yards, 14 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. I think this will be a very fun game. I expect Duke to make it very tough on the Mustangs, but I am taking SMU to stay ranked, win this game, and go to 7-1 on the season. But that is the pick segment for this week, and that is the entire episode. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you again next week for another episode of State of the FBS.